one by one. So welcome everyone. Whoops. I don't know that I meant to forward that, but here we go. Welcome everybody. This is the rapid response talk from the post-election rapid response talks from Zero to Thrive Translational Network. I'm Allison Miller. I'm the steering committee chair of the Zero to Thrive Translational Network, and we're so happy and excited that everybody's here today. Thanks for making time in your busy schedules to come and talk about issues that are affecting children and young families and pregnant moms, and some policy ideas around what we can do to address these issues. Wanted to just say a few words around the Translational Network. We'll hear more about the Zero to Thrive program as well. The Translational Network is really seeking to bring together U of M faculty with community stakeholders to address real-world solutions to these problems families may face from the preconception period, really through early childhood. And so we'll hear about all of that today, which is really exciting. We're really hoping to create multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, cross-sector collaborations to promote advocacy in this area, to create opportunities to engage community and research, program development, and to really think about novel solutions for issues facing young children and families who face adversity. I wanted to also, the little pictures along the top are folks who are involved in the Translational Network, and particularly the steering committee. So Maria Music and Kate Rosenblum are the co-founders of the Zero to Thrive program or initiative. I'm Allison. I mentioned I'm the steering committee chair. Natasha Pilkauskas is this Translational Network steering committee member. I should say I'm from the School of Public Health. Kate and Maria are in psychiatry. Natasha is at the Ford School of Public Policy. Josh Kay is another steering committee member at the law school. Nicole Gardner-Neblett is in the Department of Psychology, and she's also one of our speakers today, so double thank you there. Elizabeth Langen is a steering committee member and in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And then finally, a huge thank you to Lynette Beery, who's the manager of the Zero to Thrive program and has been instrumental in putting together and keeping together this network. And there's my forwarding, okay. So just a few words about our agenda. These are the opening remarks. Then Dr. Kate Rosenblum will give an overview of Zero to Thrive. We'll hear a few words of welcome from Dr. Gregory Dalek, who's the chair of psychiatry. And then we'll have our presentations and discussion, which will be moderated by Alicia Guevara-Warren. And then we'll have some closing remarks, next steps. We will everybody make sure they're muted at the moment. I think everybody is. And we'll try to hold questions after each talk so that we can have a fuller discussion towards the end. Here are our speakers. Will be, as you can see, they're an interdisciplinary group. Alicia will be our moderator, and then Nell Duke and Nicole Gardner-Neblett will be presenting together on early childhood education. Alexis Handel from the School of Public Health will be presenting next on maternal child health and work conditions. And then Kara Zivin from Psychiatry and OBGYN will be presenting around maternal mental health, and everybody will address policy implications. Sorry, I keep getting the delay. So that's me. You've heard from me. So let me introduce Kate Rosenblum. Kate is a clinical and developmental psychologist who is based in the Department of Psychiatry and OBGYN. Whoops. So there's my forwarding. Kate is, as I mentioned, a co-founder of the Zero to Thrive initiative and co-director of the Women and Infant Mental Health Program. Kate conducts research on infant mental health and parenting, and also conducts community-based interventions. So we are thrilled that Kate is here to talk a little bit more about Zero to Thrive for us. So I will pause and hand it over to Kate. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Allison, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have so many of you here, and I'm wanting to just share a special thank you to all of our panelists who have put together presentations to share with us about their work and their thoughts about how we move forward in the coming year to really address in particular issues related to the health, well-being in a variety of different domains of families with young kids, or from conception really through early childhood. Facing various forms of adversities and stresses, as many families are, and with a particular eye towards thinking about equity and racial justice. I just really appreciate the time that you're contributing to our thinking and look forward to hearing the presentations and the discussion. And thank you also to Alicia Guevara-Warren for agreeing to moderate our discussion. I think this will be really rich. I just wanted to say a few words about Zero to Thrive. Zero to Thrive is an initiative that is housed in the Department of Psychiatry at Michigan Medicine, but as Allison mentioned, includes and encompasses a translational network that is a cross-campus, multidisciplinary, sort of interdisciplinary effort, bringing together faculty and staff from across the university and really harnessing the expertise in the domains of sort of pregnancy and early childhood through attention to research, to training and education, to service, and also to think about policy and to really inform policy through all of those different efforts. So we have really terrific faculty and staff who do work in these domains. And I think today you're really going to benefit from hearing some of the most outstanding sort of thinkers and leaders in this field and in this area, helping us to think about the experiences of families, of women, families, moving forward and the policy implications. I will now actually introduce Dr. Gregory Dalick, who is going to be sharing a few opening remarks for our panel today. Dr. Dalick, if you could advance to the next slide, please, is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan. And I just want to say a few things about Dr. Dalick. First of all, his commitment to public health is clear in all of his work and service at the university across our state and nationally. His interests in his own research really have focused on the treatment of chronic and persistent mental illness, particularly schizophrenia. Over the past 8 years, he's been involved in reducing barriers to accessing care by developing collaborative care programs to provide psychiatric and behavioral health expertise within primary care clinics, not only at Michigan Medicine and Washtenaw, but across the state. As department chair, he's really played a pivotal role in supporting the establishment and launching of Zero to Thrive, and really has made possible this rapid response talk through that early support. So we're really grateful. And it reflected his strong commitment to promoting the health and well-being of children and families from conception through early childhood who are facing adversity. So his commitment to this program extended to the establishment of a cross-university translational network of faculty and staff doing this research service, training and policy work. And from the outset, I think he really appreciated the power, the potential of bringing together and harnessing this cross-university expertise. You will see that many schools and departments are represented in this translational network, and that this translational network is also not just a translational research network or translational practice network, but really broadly a translational network that represents the full potential and expertise of each of these areas that an academic medical center and academic university setting have to offer. So we're just really delighted to have him share some thoughts with us about the presentation today, and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Dalick. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege for me to be here, to be with you all, and to make just a few brief remarks. Such an august group and important work that you're doing. We're in an extraordinary time in which the impact of the COVID pandemic on families and their communities, and the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black, Indigenous, and people of color has focused our attention on long-standing social injustice and systemic racism that ramifies to health disparities and increased risk of serious and chronic illness for the next generation. Zero to Thrive really brings together a broad array of outstanding thought leaders, including researchers, clinical investigators, policy experts, and many others, to work together on the imperative of improving the health, education, and well-being of families from preconception through pregnancy and into childhood. And the strength of Zero to Thrive, from my perspective, lies in its multidisciplinary expertise that's brought to bear with the greatest potential to impact and identify and solve some of the most important and complex problems we face. During the COVID pandemic, Zero to Thrive really stepped up in major ways, and the passion of its members to address the issues that were faced by pregnant women and families with young children was really ignited further by the pandemic. They developed educational materials, trainings, provided support for frontline staff, published a coloring storybook that's now in the National Library of Medicine called George and the Giant Germ to teach young children and families about the pandemic. Today's event continues that work, focusing on advocacy and policy with these post-election policy rapid response talks. I personally want to thank the organizers and the speakers and all of you who are in attendance for your commitment and your efforts to advance the laudable goals that Zero to Thrive champions, both for young children and their families. I wish you a wonderful meeting. I look forward to the presentations. Thank you for the chance to make a few comments.
All right. I can say just a few words of introduction to our moderator, Alicia Guevara Warren. She is an expert in early childhood policy, and we are so lucky and thankful for having her here today. She's going to give an overview of the state of young children. I should say Alicia is the director of statewide policy initiatives with the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, and also formerly project director at Kids Count. And so I think she will do a really important piece here with regard to sort of laying out the space and the data so that we can really deeply think about some of these issues and challenges facing young children and their families. So with that, take it away, Alicia.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Thank you, everyone, for joining today for such an important and timely topic as we transition into both here at the state level new legislative session, but also to some pretty, I think, significant changes that we'll see at the federal level. I also just want to add really quickly, there's just so much happening in energy around how we really create systems and through the use of policy change to really improve outcomes in the lives of young children and their families throughout the country. So really happy to be with you all today. I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about some things that are going on so that we have kind of a foundational understanding of the well-being of kids. I'm going to talk about a couple of different factors. Mind you, this is not comprehensive, and we have some really great speakers who will follow and try to fill in some of those gaps. But just to give us kind of a high-level overview of how families are doing right now, when we look at just overall, we have about 1 million kiddos between the ages of 0 and 8 here in the state of Michigan. About 1 in 3 children ages 0 to 8 identifies as a child of color. So something to note as we go through the data. When we look at economic well-being and we look specifically at jobs and workforce, pre-pandemic, about 70% of kids under the age of 6 have both parents in the workforce. So that's really telling of the types of supports and systems that need to be in place to support having 2 parents in the workforce and what that means for our young children. Moving forward into the current environment with the onset of the pandemic, we have seen many families losing jobs. We've seen a lot of families struggling in economic well-being, struggling with food security, with childcare, and a number of things. We see that about 55% of adults with children of all ages have lost a job during the pandemic. And when we look at that information by race and ethnicity, we can see that families of color are more disproportionately impacted by the changing economy. So a little bit about health, and you have a number of health experts that are going to talk about this in depth, but about 111,000 babies are born every year here in the state of Michigan. And as Dr. Black noted, it's important to think about that preconception period as well as the prenatal period, all the way through the impacts that it has on outcomes over a lifespan. So looking specifically at prenatal care here for women here in the state of Michigan, about almost 33% of births were to moms who received less than adequate prenatal care. About 5% of those births are to women who received care either late or no care at all. When we look at the data broken down by race and ethnicity, we see that that percentage rate actually the difference between white non-Hispanic and Black, African American, Latino, Hispanic, and American Indian, that rate is actually double. Those things are all really important because we know about kind of the long-term effects on birth outcomes, along with the other barriers that women of color face, like racism and other things that have an impact on preterm births, low birth weight, infant mortality, maternal mortality, and all of those indicators. I brought up some data here around immunizations, only because, as we've seen in the pandemic, a lot of kids are actually not, being able to or choosing not to get their vaccines at this time, just because we're seeing a lot of fewer check-ins at the doctors, those annual appointments, and young kiddos not getting those immunizations. So this is a number that we'll want to look at. The state of Michigan has spent a lot of energy around trying to get this number up. So the 74% of toddlers who were fully immunized is a pre-pandemic number. So that's something that we'll continue to watch and see what type of outreach and work needs to be done in that space for young kids. Another area that I think is really important for us to think about, both prior to the pandemic, but also with the implications that the pandemic has had with fewer children. We've seen reports of child abuse and neglect go down during this time period because children don't have those same touch points. It's going to be really important. Our child welfare system has been strained for a number of years, and it'll be a continued area for us to really focus in on through policy work to think about how we support families and try to prevent abuse and neglect. One of the things to note is when we look at abuse and neglect cases, the vast majority of them are neglect, which often is, some inability to provide basic needs like housing and food. And so when we think about the systems that we can set up in place to really prevent children from entering the child welfare system, that's something to keep in mind. A couple of other notes on this data is that we can see here that young children and children of color in particular are disproportionately subject to investigations of abuse and neglect. They're more likely to be confirmed as victims of abuse and neglect, and they're also more likely to be removed from their homes. So I think these numbers are pretty startling and really help us to understand where we need to target some of our interventions and policy work around infants and communities of color. So very quickly, I wanted to touch on some of the supports that are available and assistance that we've made available through policies for young children and families. About 44% of young children live in a family with low income. Here we're looking at about 200% of the federal poverty level. This is a number that, if you're familiar with the work done by the United Ways around the ALICE population, so the asset limited income constrained employed population. These are folks that are often working and that are working in jobs that don't pay livable wages, and so they struggle to meet some of the basic needs for themselves and their families. This is all really important because we make these programs available with both federal and state funding, but some of these programs are controlled specifically by the state. So you'll see that the FIT program, which is the Family Independence Program, which is our traditional cash assistance program, only about 1.5% of children ages 0 to 8 are receiving this type of assistance. This is a program that eligibility is controlled by our state. We have chosen to make eligibility for this program so low that many families aren't able to actually access this assistance even though they need it. On the other side of that, you see the FAT program, the food assistance program. A much higher number of families are able to access that program. Almost 1 in 4 children between the ages of 0 and 8 are receiving some sort of food assistance. This is a program that's controlled more or less by federal regulations, and there is a lot of federal funding that goes into this program. And so you start seeing some of the discrepancies between what's controlled by state and what's controlled by the federal government. Similarly, with our child care subsidy, this comes to us through a block grant and is very limited in funding. Only about 2.3% of children between ages 0 to 12, we can't get the data publicly for 0 to 8. So that 0 to 12 number, represents a larger, number, but children are eligible to receive child care subsidy through age 12. But only about 2.3% of children are actually receiving that, when we know that for those of us who have children, have utilized childcare. Childcare is very expensive and many times unaffordable for families, particularly when we go back and think through that 2/3 of young children have both parents in the workforce. Yet only just over 2% of kiddos and families are receiving the childcare subsidy. And again, this is something that we have a lot of control of from the state's perspective. We set our eligibility level at one of the lowest entry eligibilities in the country. Beginning in January 1st, this will actually rise to a little higher. This was a recent policy win that I'll note a little bit later, but it's still very low when we compare ourselves to other states in the country. Just a note on Medicaid, about 42.3% of our births are paid for through Medicaid. Many children continue to receive Medicaid after through birth and through their childhood. Through our home visiting programs, about 29,000 families were served in the most recent year of data that's available. A couple of things to note here. So when we talk about home visiting, we are talking about longer programs. We're not talking about just that one type of visit, but when we think a little bit more globally about the type of interventions and support really that home visiting types of programs can make, it's really important to also think about how 79% of families did not receive any type of home visit, whether it was as a part of a full program or even just one visit following the birth of their child. Early On is another program. Up until recently, Michigan was one of the only states in the country that did not provide any state appropriations to Early On, which is our Part C, our IDA Part C program, early intervention for children through age 2. Only 3.3% of kids in our state are receiving Early On services, which is about 11,000 kids. Some communities do put in additional dollar to serve higher numbers within their communities, but it's really led to inequities across geography. Depending on where you live, you may not be able to access it, and funds may be even more limited. So very quickly, I want to just talk a little bit about early care and education, because this is a topic that is really received a lot of energy, and there's a lot of bipartisan support both at the state and federal level. Every single package that has come through around COVID relief, I know we're stalled in Congress waiting for them to do something, but every package that has come through as a proposal has included some level of funding to help stabilize the childcare industry. Much of this is related to the fact that it has been recognized now that we can't have an economic recovery without childcare. And so more and more policymakers are talking about how do we support the system? How do we make it more affordable for families? So this is a really energizing conversation for us to, I think, have in the moment. Looking at early learning enrollment. So here I've captured a number of things. So we're talking about preschool, public and private, other programs that aren't considered childcare. Sometimes in the data are called nursery school and such. But this is, overall as a state, only 60% of young kids between the ages of 3 and 4 are accessing any type of early learning program. And those numbers are slightly lower for both the Hispanic Latino community and the Black and African American community. And then a number that we've all heard probably way more than what we'd like is that our 3rd grade reading proficiency scores are really, really low in our state. Once we moved years ago now from our MEEP testing to our MSTEP testing, we've kind of watched these numbers stay roughly about the same over the years. We think about the impact that the pandemic has had on education, both from an early learning perspective and kiddos being ready for preschool and kindergarten, but also our kids moving forward in the K-12 space and what that impact is going to be. So we know how important early learning is to setting kids up for both just being ready for kindergarten, but also to build on to their 3rd grade reading scores, which is an important long-term educational benchmark. So after all the depressing data, we'll talk about some of the recent policy wins that I think are just incredibly great to talk about, particularly in a time when, we went into the most recent state budget that we're currently in that was signed to start October 1st. Many of us advocates thought there's no way we're going to see, any increases in programs. We're going to be fighting tooth and nails to just hold on to what we have. And with the help of the federal government and that support that we got, it really helped with the state budget and being able to still invest and increase access and enrollment for families in some of these programs. So in childcare, like I mentioned already, we'll see an increase in our entry eligibility for childcare subsidy beginning on January 1st. So it'll go from 130% to 150% of the federal poverty level. As I mentioned, many states are way ahead of us here. So many states are up to 200% of the federal poverty level, if not higher. But this is a win for Michigan, considering just a few years ago, we were at 120% of the federal poverty level for entry eligibility. We also see policymakers willing here at the state level to take some shots at doing something innovative. There is pilot funding that's been made available for a TriShare childcare project, which will look at how do we utilize employers in the equation for paying for childcare. So it's called TriShare because it's a third paid by the employer, a third paid by the family, and a third of the cost paid through the childcare subsidy. So that's a new project that is being implemented. So we'll look forward to the results of that as it is implemented. We also saw a huge number of maternal and child health wins around home visiting, particularly looking at how we can start setting ourselves up as a state for Families First Prevention Services Act. So when we think back to the data that I showed around the child welfare system, Families First is a prevention type of legislation that Congress passed 2 years ago to really help states focus some of the resources in on prevention to keep kids out of the child welfare system. So home visiting is a part of that equation, and we've seen the state put some money in and start thinking about how we can set ourselves up to draw down those federal dollars for expanding home visiting. We also saw Medicaid postpartum extension for women on Medicaid, which is a really fantastic win. The appropriation is there, and now we're waiting for the feds to approve that policy waiver that we need. And then just very quickly, I'm trying to be cognizant of time. We have, the state has put a lot of money into various, whether it's food assistance or childcare, utilizing those federal dollars to really try to address the crisis that we're currently in. So just a couple of last notes. So those are the big policy wins. What we have looking forward to us here at the state level, we have policymakers and the governor both talking about during this lame duck session, doing something with state funds that provide some additional COVID relief, very targeted to healthcare essential workers, looking at the unemployment benefits, food assistance, some level of child care assistance for families with school-age children. And at the federal level, I'm sure you all are watching the same as I am. Hopefully there's some sort of bipartisan compromise. We've seen several packages come out, most recently this one that is bipartisan in nature, and we will see what happens in the next handful of days. Two last things that I want to mention that I think are important for folks to know. There are some pretty fantastic policy initiatives happening here in the state. If you're interested in connecting with either of those, I'm a little biased to this one because I act as the lead for the state on our prenatal to 3 policy initiative. This is a part of a national movement of states really looking at how do we increase access and enrollment to high quality programs for infants and toddlers and their families? So we have about 1,300 people who have joined the movement and leaders across the state who are engaged in trying to drive this policy agenda. We also have, led by the Michigan Department of Education, the Preschool Development Grant, Birth Through 5. This is a federal grant, competitive, designed to really focus in on uplifting the system, looking at how do we focus on kind of from birth all the way through that spectrum, and thinking about kindergarten, thinking about transitions, thinking about school readiness. They are a great partner in a lot of the work that's happening across the state and in our communities, really looking at how they bring in parents and family voice to the work that they're doing as well. So with that, there is my contact information. If you're interested in the P3 policy initiative, you can go to ECIC's website and look at our policy page and get more information there. So I took longer than my 10 minutes, so I'm going to transition us quickly to Dr. Nell Duke, who is a professor in the School of Education, and Dr. Nicole Gardner-Neblett, who is an assistant professor of psychology.
Okay, thank you. Do I have... Hi, everyone. Looking forward to talking with you today about curve cut thinking. And if you're not familiar with that term, I'll introduce you to it in just a moment. So we'll be talking today with you about how to use curve cut thinking to improve children's literacy. Okay, so here's an overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll share with you some information about racial and ethnic disparities in literacy. Alicia gave you a little bit of a preview in terms of what's happening in Michigan, and I'll talk to you about that at the national level. I'll also talk to you about the achievement gap paradigm and why this paradigm may be problematic for making improvements in children's literacy. And I'll talk with you about a more promising alternative, which is leading with racial equity. And I'll explain to you curve cut thinking, and then I will turn it over to Nell Duke to talk to you about some policies, some curb-cut policies. Okay, so here I have some national data for you that comes from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And if you look at that dark line in the middle, that's all children. And so that shows you that about 35% of all children are reading at proficient level in the 4th grade. And by proficiency, we mean this, it's an intermediate kind of level. So it's above basic, but not as high as advanced. And it means that children can read at a level where they can take text and draw inferences, make connections based on what they're reading. And you can see that 35% of all children are able to do that. And when we disaggregate this by race, we see some big racial differences in that white and Asian Pacific Islander children are reading proficiently at higher levels than Black children, Latinx children, and American Indian children. And so the common achievement gap paradigm is to compare and try and ask the questions of why are Black and Latinx children and American Indian children not reading at levels comparable to white children. And so this is a familiar paradigm and one that has created decades of efforts to try and understand this problem, and millions of dollars have been put towards it. But focusing on this paradigm has not gotten us as far as we would like, and I'm suggesting that a new approach is needed. And that is because the achievement gap paradigm, this paradigm of comparing Black and brown children with white children, is problematic for several reasons. So I'm going to give you only 3 of them today. One is that it maintains low expectations for all children. 2, that it overlooks the impact of historic and systemic inequities. And 3, that it ignores the strengths of Black and brown children. So I'm going to go through each of these in more detail. Okay, so if we return back to this graph that I just showed you a little while ago, we will see that you've seen that I highlight here that 45% of white children are reading at proficient levels. So that means that 55% of white children are not reading at proficient levels. That's more than half. So if we take this achievement gap paradigm and say, okay, we want to eliminate the gap in achievement between Black and brown children and white children, that would still leave more than half of Black and brown children not reading at proficient levels. And this maintains this low expectations that we don't expect Black and brown children to be able to read more than white children, and that we don't really expect white children to more than half of them to be reading at these levels. And this is problematic because we know that children, when given the resources and the opportunities, can reach higher levels of reading proficiency. And we must simply expect that more children, Black children, brown children, white children even, can read at higher levels of proficiency. And this idea of comparing Black and brown children to white children is problematic. There's some research that comes out of the University of Southern California that shows that when we present to teachers this idea of the achievement gap, they are less likely to think it's a priority than if we present it to them as information about the racial inequity in education. So just even how we frame this topic can have some implications. So that's one problem. So let's go to the second problem. So the second problem is that it overlooks the impact of historic and systemic inequities. So I have just a few of those inequities here. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but we can see that there are many of these factors here are important for affecting children's literacy development. So these things have created a legacy for Black and brown children. Of all of them are tied in some way to racism and systemic problems. And then we also know that just as a factor, there's a lot of policies that have happened that have created some inequities in the resources. So there's a report that came out by EdBuild, and they showed that non-white school districts get $23 billion less than white school districts, even though these school districts are serving the same number of students. So with that level of pervasiveness in terms of the disparities in funding, in terms of what these school districts are getting, it's no surprise that we see these disparities by race and that they continue to persist over time. Okay, a third problem is that by looking at the achievement gap and comparing Black and brown children to white children, we ignore the strengths that Black and brown children have. So when we compare Black and brown children to white children, we establish white children as the norm, as the ideal, even though I've shown you data that show that white children have issues in terms of performance, in terms of literacy. And in doing so, we ignore the strengths that Black and brown children have, or we in some way find them deficient. And so oftentimes these strengths are not seen, they're not incorporated into curriculum decisions, into instruction decisions, into schooling decisions, and this represents missed opportunities to promote literacy. So there's some research that has shown that when Black children are presented with passages and information, with themes that are consistent with their own experiences and their cultural experiences, their reading comprehension, their comprehension is higher than when they are not presented with this kind of information. And so that just gives you a taste of how we could be potentially using the strengths that Black children have to promote better literacy. But unfortunately, this rarely happens. Now, Duke and I are working on a project where we are looking for, we're working on a curriculum to improve the early childhood experiences of infants and toddlers. And we've been spending time, actually over a year now, looking for books that feature Black and brown children. And I will tell you, and she will probably speak to this as well, that the pickings are slim. It's very rare that we find these books, even just for infants and toddlers. There's some books for older children, but for older children, the themes tend to be around oppression, civil rights, or slavery, as opposed to being themes of just everyday life, just regular everyday life. So again, lots of missed opportunities to promote literacy and academic achievement in general. So I propose that we stop talking about this as an achievement gap, and that we use something that is a little bit more promising, because we've been talking about this achievement gap for decades and we haven't gotten very far. So I propose that we instead talk about leading with racial equity. Pathways to Grade Level Reading. It's an initiative that I was involved in North Carolina when I lived there. And they define leading with racial equity as prioritizing strategies that specifically work to improve outcomes for children of color and giving special consideration to the wisdom and innovation of people of color to develop responses that are lasting and reach all children. So the idea is that if we can focus on specific policies, specific strategies that benefit Black and brown children in terms of their literacy, we will benefit all children. This comes from these things. These are curb cuts. Now, you probably use these all the time and probably never give it a second thought, but there are sections of a curb that are cut out to provide accessibility. The first curb cut was actually created here in Michigan, 1945 in Kalamazoo, just down the block from Ann Arbor, where we are. And it took a while, though. It took some decades before these curb cuts came all throughout the nation. And they came as part of the chauvinist. So he was a quadriplegic. He became a quadriplegic after an accident that he had while he was serving in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. And he came back and settled in the Berkeley, California area. And he was a very strong advocate for the rights of the disabled. And he was advocating for improved accessibility for years. Well, one night in the early 1970s, he and his friends in their wheelchairs decided they were going to pour some cement down on the side of the curb just to create a makeshift ramp. The police found out about it and threatened to arrest them, but they didn't. But what they were able to do is to prove that if we could just make this simple change, we can improve accessibility. So Michael and other advocates went along to have changes made in Berkeley. So hundreds of curb cuts were introduced. And over the course of several years, more and more of these curb cuts were introduced across the country. But it wasn't until President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 that curb cuts became mandated, along with other changes to the environment. And since that, so improve accessibility for people with disabilities. And since that change, we see that nearly everywhere you go, there are curb cuts, right? This is mandated by law to provide additional accessibility to people in wheelchairs. But we also see that these curb cuts benefit other people in society. So people with parents with strollers benefit from curb cuts. If you've ever had luggage and lugging around luggage in the city, you've benefited from curb cuts. Even children on scooters benefit from curb cuts. So the idea is that you take this one strategy that was specifically targeted to one particular vulnerable group, and it has benefited all of society. So Angela Glover Blackwell, who is the founder of PolicyLink, has talked about how oftentimes in policy policymakers may overlook how the long-term effects that making one change for one particular vulnerable group can benefit other people. So she says, cut into the curb and we create a path forward for everyone. So imagine if we applied this kind of thinking to improving the literacy outcomes of Black and Brown children. Imagine if we were able to identify policies that worked for Black and Brown children very well. This could mean improving literacy for all children. So I'm going to turn it over to Neldu to talk to you about some of those policies.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So indeed, I'm going to try to talk about some examples of curb cut policies in literacy. So the first one I'm going to talk about is class size reduction. As Nicole already indicated, this is one place where we see racial inequity. And I think it doesn't take a classroom teacher to know that if you're trying to teach this many first graders how to read as a classroom teacher, that's a lot harder than trying to teach this many. And the second number is the number that research suggests is about the class size that we ought to have for young children. So class size reduction is definitely a place to work toward racial equity, but it is a curb cut policy because creating caps on class sizes for kindergarten, first and second grade doesn't only benefit situations in which districts have very large class sizes across the district, but also benefit situations in which even wealthy districts sometimes have certain schools and certain occasions. That happened with my own daughter, as a matter of fact, where she just kept getting in these big classes year after year just by happenstance of who lived in the neighborhood and the circumstances around the number of teachers and so on. So class size reduction really could benefit many groups. Another area that is implicated in class size reduction is school funding equity. So if you don't follow it, Rutgers Law Center produces a school funding equity fairness report card on a regular basis, and it gives us information about school funding fairness for every state in the US. And they look at two really important factors. First of all, just how equitable is the distribution of funding across different sorts of school districts, but then also what's the fiscal effort, how much of the gross state product and how much income in the state is devoted to school funding, because you could have an equitable school funding model but underfunded across the board, or you could have a lot of funding for schools but be distributing it inequitably. So ideally you want A's across the board here, which is what you see in, for example, New Jersey. Here's how Michigan did on the most recent report card. So you see there's a lot of work to do in this state, both in terms of the amount of funding for schools and in terms of the equitability of the distribution of that funding. And again, this is a curb cut policy because we want to lift up the funding really that's provided to all schools and make it a particular effort to improve the equitability of the distribution. Nicole also alluded to access to books. So I say that teaching kids to read without books is like teaching kids to swim without water. It's not going to go very well, right? You have to have access to books. We have a lot of existing research on book access that points to lots of inequitability in terms of things like access to public libraries, the size and quality of public library collections, school libraries, the likelihood that there's a school media librarian available within the school, the size of the collection, how old the collection is. So we have lots of evidence already that there is great inequity in the degree to which kids have access to books in general. A more recent study is I think really adds an interesting layer to this, and part of this study was done in Michigan. What they looked at is the availability of books to purchase. So if we have families who want to purchase books for their young child to use, what is the likelihood that they're going to be able to find those books? How many books are even available for purchase? So they looked at 3 neighborhood types. The first were very high poverty neighborhoods. And they found that in high poverty neighborhoods, between for any one child, depending on the neighborhood, there would, I'm sorry, for any one book available to sell in a neighborhood, there would be 13 children who would need to share that book. And in some high poverty neighborhoods they studied, it would be 830 children sharing one book for sale. In other words, there's hardly any opportunity to purchase books in certain high poverty neighborhoods. Borderline neighborhoods are these kind of in the census tract, what they call the borderline tract neighborhoods, more mixed neighborhoods economically. And there, in some neighborhoods, there would be one book to purchase for every one child in that neighborhood. But in others, there would be 11 children, again, sharing one book to purchase. In higher income neighborhoods, based on a different study, previous research, there are about 300 books that could be purchased for any one child. So you see how massive the inequity is. One child, 830 children sharing one book, or one child having access to 300 books for sale. So this is clearly an area where we see inequity that is racially and socioeconomically enacted. But again, it's an opportunity really for curb cut policy, because increasing book access and evening out book access across the state is likely to result in more books in general, which supports the children's book publishing industry, which then creates the opportunity for more books, more innovative books, and so on. So the term that the authors used is book deserts. I think a lot of people on this webinar today are probably familiar with the concept of a food desert, but to understand that we also have book deserts, and we have book deserts in some of the very same places where we see food deserts. This is a very fixable problem from a policy perspective. We've got lots of research on how to get books in children's hands. We know how to do this, and we know the positive effects of it, but it does take a policy will to get it done. As Nicole also alluded to, it's not just the number of books, it's the quality of books, and in particular, making sure that Black and Brown children have the opportunity to see themselves in books. A scholar by the name of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop has a metaphor that she uses, that books need to provide us both windows and mirrors. So windows are the opportunity to see other cultures, different worlds, different experiences through books. And mirrors are being able to see our own culture and people in books who look like us and who share cultural values and backgrounds with us. And a healthy opportunity for children is to have a mix of windows and mirrors. But what we see is that for lots of children, it's all windows in their early grades education. And there's psychological research to suggest that that's actually impeding their overall literacy development. If we put more money into production and purchase of books that are mirrors for our Black and Brown children, that actually would be a curb cut policy, because it would produce more windows for other children, right? So another curb cut policy opportunity for us. The last one I want to talk about today is going to require that I take us back into the data that Nicole shared early on about the National Assessment of Educational Progress 4th grade reading scores. This is a released passage from the NAEP 4th grade test. So children are supposed to read this passage, which goes on for 2 more pages. And you can see it has all sorts of interesting informational text features and, really challenging language and vocabulary. And after children read that, they're supposed to answer this multiple choice question. According to the article, why has it been so difficult to keep white sharks in captivity? So that requires comprehension, a little bit of inference. It requires that you know what the word captivity even means, right? So it's pretty challenging. And then that's followed up by an open-ended item in which children are asked, based on the article, is it a good idea to keep white sharks in captivity? Explain your answer using information from the article. This is a very challenging item as well that requires not only reading and processing, but writing too. A lot of policymakers and even some researchers have the idea that we have these low levels of literacy in the US because children can't read words. And it is certainly true that we have a proportion of kids in the US who don't read words well, and that is the primary problem for them in terms of success on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. But actually, you can see from these items in this passage that there's a lot more required than just being able to read words. And this is a box from a policy piece I wrote in which I listed a wide range of different constructs that are required to do well on this test and that research shows teachers can improve with proper instruction. So that brings us to the issue of improving teacher quality or teacher practice. In other words, doing a lot more to help teachers be able to develop all these many constructs in children so that we really have many more children performing well on NAEP fourth grade reading and other assessments. I've argued that the complexity of teaching young children, a diverse classroom of first grade children to read, is akin to the complexity of being an ER physician in terms of the content knowledge required, the multitasking required, the executive skill, all of these different kinds of relational expertise and more. But historically in the US, for reasons we could get into that mostly have to do with gender politics, an ER physician is going to get 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, a healthy residency, and probably a post-residency specialty. Whereas in the US, you can become a teacher in a year of education with emergency credential, even less. And even our best teacher preparation programs are typically 2 years long. So you can see where teachers need a lot more ongoing support or ongoing teacher professional learning. That is, they need help throughout their careers to continue to learn and develop as teachers and to align with the latest research. And indeed, meta-analyses show that we can really instructional coaching, in effective instructional practices, in having high expectations for all children, including Black and Brown children, and in providing culturally responsive and sustaining educational practices in classrooms. So to sum up, some of probably the 300 curb cut policies that Nicole and I would love to talk about, 5 of the ones we had time for are reducing class sizes, creating more equitable school funding models, providing greater access to books, paying particular attention to getting culturally relevant books in the hands of children, and providing ongoing teacher professional learning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duke and Dr. Gardner-Neblett. Just fantastic information and appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over next to Dr. Alexis Handel, who's an associate professor of epidemiology in the School of Public Health.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move now this discussion a little bit to more of a focus on work as a determinant of maternal and child health and child development using a health equity lens. So evidence indicates that early child development has a strong influence not only on health outcomes, but also on social outcomes, which we know from the social epidemiologic literature have implications for population health patterning. And relatedly, it also has a life course perspective. So what happens in early life has an impact on adult health. And then at a more societal level, optimal child development is critical for economic stability, for increased social and human capital. And so the inequities that we see in early life and early child development can manifest and lead to inequities in life chances. And then that results in a broad range of inequities that we would see at the societal level. So child development is a complex process and it's affected by numerous factors, not only at the individual or biological level, but also at the community and at the societal level. So for example, individual and familial factors are important, like the home environment or environmental exposures, infectious diseases, as some examples. But also then going out a little bit, social, cultural, and community factors like child rearing norms or societal norms of gender differences, as well as power relations. And then structural factors like the healthcare system, or what are the educational policies, political will. And the area where I've focused my work has been around understanding the labor structure and employment policies, industrial contamination, and all the issues that kind of come with work being a determinant of health. So when we think about work as a structural determinant of health, we know that in general, employment has a net benefit to the family. However, employment experiences are not uniformly advantageous. And so there are some groups of workers that have more exposures, have heavier demands and lower autonomy or control, as well as social isolation. And we have to consider those differential and unequal, the differential and the unequal impact of these experiences for those different groups. And so in particular, we want to think about how work impacts women in a differential way. So there are numerous pathways for how work can impact in a gendered way. For example, women are often channeled into more non-standard forms of work or female occupations, and they continue to bear the greater burden of not only working outside the home for pay, but then also being responsible for domestic or care responsibilities. And there are modifying effects of class and ethnicity as well. So there's considerable research on working women and the impact on reproductive health outcomes. Historically, the focus has been on the physical environment, and on more recently, there's been some focus on the impact of chemical exposures during pregnancy and early child development, but not really a focus on female workers specifically. An area that's really lacked focus is studying the relationship between occupational stress and chemical exposures within a social context. And so particularly in the context of what we would call precarious employment, so exploitative employment or unstable employment. And so there are a few studies really that have looked at the impact of this relationship on maternal and child health and child development. So there's been several recent reports in the last 5 years or so from the International Labor Organization and the World Bank and among other organizations that all highlight the changes and the impacts globally regarding the female participation in the labor force. And in general, in most regions around the world, there has been an increase in the labor force, as you can see here represented by the blue lines. And the US is no exception. Women make up almost half of the share of the labor force, and the majority of the women in the formal labor force are of reproductive age. Many women, particularly women of color or immigrants in the US, but also in many countries around the world, find work in what's called the low productivity sector. And that's where they find work in jobs that are stereotyped for women, so like domestic services. But for rural women, it also tends to be agriculture. And they often face more precarious work conditions like exposures and lack of representation or agency, discrimination and harassment, and other forms of increased stress. And so if we think about, given that there's this magnitude of workers that are women and mainly of reproductive age, we need to consider the implications of toxic exposure related to work and child development. And by toxic, and why I have it in quotes, is that I'm referring not only to chemical exposures, but also to all of those other social exposures that I was mentioning, like adverse social environments and poverty, and which together with chemical exposure can have an interactive negative impact on child development. And we know that fetuses and young children are more susceptible and more likely to be exposed due to their developing physiology, as well as their behaviors and their environments. So kind of with that background, I wanted to discuss this issue of labor exploitation, precarious employment, and farm workers within the US context. So farm workers play an essential role in the US multi-billion-dollar agricultural and food system. The majority of the workforce is US and foreign-born Latinx workers, and about a third of the workforce is female. And most farm workers report having at least 1 to 2 minor children in their household. And despite the fact that they are essential workers and experience a range of adverse conditions like labor exploitation and poverty or food insecurity, which lead to adverse health outcomes, there really hasn't been a lot of protections for these workers. And there's very little information specifically on the female farm workers and pregnant farm workers in particular, and the impact on their families. So I think it's important also to recognize that the inequities that are faced by farm workers are rooted in historical and structural racism in this country. The US economy was built on slavery practices, exploitation, and occupational segregation of minoritized communities. So farm workers have been historically excluded from labor protections that are available to other workers through policies that were enacted during the Great Depression. So for example, the Fair Labor Standards Act from the New Deal introduced many protections for workers like the 40-hour work week, overtime pay, minimum wage. However, this act actually exempted many domestic, agricultural, and service occupations, which at the time were overrepresented by Black workers. It has been amended over the years, but agricultural workers and domestic workers continue to lack basic protections like paid sick leave and workers' comp. And they don't have the ability to have labor unions and have collective bargaining. And to this day, Black and brown people remain overrepresented in those occupations. It's also important to keep in mind what we mean by labor exploitation, and that it's a continuum of working and social conditions, right? So it's not just the extreme of forced labor and labor trafficking, which of course is part of that, but it can be a whole range of issues, environmental and occupational and social exposures related to the workplace. And for farm workers, there's what we call kind of the cluster of vulnerability factors, that are more associated often with farm worker populations, and it makes these workers much more susceptible to labor exploitation and to trafficking. So farm workers serve a vital role in Michigan agriculture. Michigan has the second most diverse agricultural industry after California. It's a really important industry for the state. The last study that was done estimated about 94,000 migrant and seasonal farm workers, including their household members, which include almost 43,000 children and youth under 19. And these farm workers, their working and their living conditions have remained virtually unchanged in more than half a century. So if you go to these reports that are available from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, you'll see that there's ongoing reports that show where things have improved and where things have not improved. And some of the areas, for example, that just continue to be problems are the lack of having bilingual staff available, using enforcement as a deterrent, having issues with wages and wage theft and cheating wages, as well as child labor. Okay, so just to give you a sense of where these workers are, the majority of the workers are in the western side of the state, more of the rural counties. So last year we started the Michigan Farm Worker Project. And I want to acknowledge our core research team and our funders, but particularly my colleague, Dr. Iglesias Rios, whom I initially developed the project with. But I also want to acknowledge our community partners who have been absolutely an essential and critical part of our research and our team. This project was developed because we wanted to really understand and bridge this gap in the knowledge about the conditions of farm workers in the state. To our knowledge, there had been, up until when we started, no real formal research conducted with this population around the issue of labor exploitation, despite the fact that we've seen cases of labor exploitation and unlawful labor practices with this population, as well as some federal investigations in the past regarding issues like of child labor. So the study was initially a qualitative and community study where we conducted 55 total interviews, 34 with farm workers and 21 with key stakeholders who provide different types of services to farm workers. And they were in 4 counties, mainly on the west side. And we are actually right now just starting some more additional interviews to assess the impact of the pandemic on the workers as well. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to say that the questionnaire, it was a semi-structured questionnaire based on the International Labor Organization indicators of labor exploitation. And it was also based on information that we gathered from visits to the labor camps, informal interviews we had with different stakeholders, and attending different state level committee meetings. And that was a lot of the work that Dr. Iglesias really study before we even started the study, when I was actually still at the University of New Mexico and hadn't even arrived here at Michigan yet. So, but it was critical, those were critical pre-study activities to get us, to help us understand the situation a little better, and to get us, let us get to know a lot of the organizations and agencies that are working in the field. And these were just, we had topics that were important and a priority for the farm workers, and then we had topics of discussion for the stakeholders. And with the stakeholders, we were really trying to understand where are their gaps in service provision and things like that. So I wanted to share some pictures that we took of what the housing looks like on these camps, just to give you a sense. So often the housing is like right next to the fields where the workers are working. If there's families, they are all there. So the children have kind of, that's their space. This is an example of a trailer that they live in. Bedroom, and then also like what the bathrooms look like. A lot of times they're outside. The law actually allows up to 15 people to use one bathroom. So these are some more pictures of the trailers. You can see the conditions are not good. Sorry, someone just said I was rubbing paper. Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. The trials and tribulations of Zoom, right? Okay. And so this is the results that we've had so far. And I say so far because we're still analyzing the data. Qualitative data is really rich, and so it's taking us a long time. But we had 20 female and 14 male farm worker participants, with almost all from Mexico, and with a family income of about $20,000 a year, which is in line with what we see with farm workers across the nation. And so I just wanted to highlight in the next few slides some of the emergent themes, and I've highlighted what I think are important themes that were brought up by female workers regarding maternal and child health and child development issues. So, you know, unsafe and hazardous working environment, particularly during pregnancy, regarding chemical exposures and physical strain, not having drinking water, for women having problems with hygiene and sanitation, especially during menstruation, pregnant workers facing discrimination in hiring or being fired. And so that leads to lack of disclosure of pregnancy to supervisors because they're fearful. Lack of access to medical care, particularly prenatal and postnatal care, not having the time off to go, not having clinics near where they're working, not having the ability to get to other clinics, and not being able to breastfeed after they work. And this is just a quote from one of the workers. No time to eat. We do not have time to eat, and many people have gotten sick. Since I had been working there, 7 people have fainted and fallen horribly. The next, the substandard living conditions, you know, a lot of families sharing housing units, lack of privacy, and sharing amenities, not having access to washing machines, for example, sleeping on dirty mattresses, and just overall inappropriate living conditions for young children, not having playgrounds or areas to play, things like that. And this female worker said, for me, it's not okay, especially because of the children, but also you, and it's sad. There are houses that don't have their bathroom, it's outside, they have to bathe outside, it's dirty, very dirty, and there are even bugs. They don't value the people. And then finally, workplace dynamics. For women in particular, everyone talked about racism, discrimination, and being dehumanized, being treated as just farm equipment, basically. For women, issues of sexual harassment and abuse were problematic. Having long working hours, so not being able to care for children or be with them. And childcare is a constant source of stress. And this has been exacerbated during the pandemic. And so this is a male farm worker that said, when you're not useful to them, they throw you away like a banana peel because you're not useful to them. He wants his production, that you do the work. And if you're not one of the people that does not follow what they want, they fire you. So When we were doing this work, this was pre-pandemic, and what we found was, what we call normal conditions were really pretty bad. And so this was exacerbated, of course, with the pandemic, and being that they were deemed essential workers and had to keep working, but without the protections. So our team developed these policy briefs. They're available on the School Public Health website under the Michigan Farm Worker Project. We quickly developed these because we wanted to provide recommendations based on what we were seeing from our initial analyses, that what could be done to reduce the risk of COVID infection and health complications from getting COVID. And I think that was a really important, it was distributed across many different agencies and organizations at the state level to try to help think about what they could do to protect the workers during the pandemic. It wasn't specific to female workers, I should say, it was in general. But in terms of the pandemic, when we think about work and health, there's been a very inequitable burden of the pandemic on marginalized and minoritized populations. And it's a very complex relationship between industry and government. Ag industry has a lot of power. And this is often more pronounced in unequal societies, which is the US. And it's been exacerbated by the economic turmoil that we've seen for the pandemic. So the workers are essential and they have to work because of the food system, the way it's set up in our country. There have been important strides here in Michigan at the state level to protect agricultural essential workers. We've had some communications regarding these executive orders and a lot of our recommendations, and this has been good. It's not necessarily been a focus on the female workers and their families, but it's a step forward, but there continues to be a lot of challenges regarding enforcement. We don't really know how enforcement is happening, and if it's happening, it's all very unclear. And then finally, just to finish, thinking about other policy implications, again, I want to highlight that the U.S. Social and immigration policies have played a very critical role in shaping occupational health inequities historically and also currently. Over the last 4 years of the Trump era, there's been this escalating climate of fear of deportation, incarceration in detention centers, family separation, empowerment of hate groups, as well as the lack of representation in unions. And all of that can impact how workers are protected and how they can speak up and have a voice to demand rights as every other workers have in this country. Also, it's really important that we have, and it's great that we have reforms at the state level, but with this population, reforms really have to happen at the federal level, particularly for undocumented workers, but also not just them. We have a lot of workers on H-2A visas and work visas that are administered at the federal level. And we have migrant workers that go from state to state following the crops. So it's not just like they stay here in Michigan, for example. So it's really important we think about reforms at a federal level. And so just some things to think about, ending these special exemptions from the labor rule for agricultural employers is really critical. Having health and social protections for pregnant workers and new mothers, which I don't think we have very well in general in this country for women and paid maternity leave, for example, but especially for these workers. And I think it's also important we think about a more centralized system at the federal level for following these workers and the provision of health and social services for these workers so that it's not changing every time they move to a different place. Also, the reversal of the Trump era expansion of the public charge limits. This has been disastrous for accessing prenatal care for undocumented women. And so I think that would be very important. And then also in terms of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, there were some important regulations and bans for neurotoxins used in agricultural industry that were moving forward from the Obama administration, and that was all rolled back or stopped or paused. And so we need to think about the reversal of those Trump era rollbacks for those neurotoxins that impact brain development, and the evidence shows that. And then finally, there's a critical need for continued research and funding for this research, and getting the data and getting the evidence, because that is how we can push forward changes in policy. And that's the goal for our team is that we can do the work to get the evidence to be able to have some kind of influence on changes in policy for these workers and for their families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Handel. I greatly appreciate the work that you're doing in this area. Now we're going to shift to Dr. Kara Zibin, who's a professor of psychiatry and a professor of OB-GYN at the University of Michigan Medical School.
I apologize for the delay. I was trying to get myself back onto the slides, and now I don't see the slides. I just see faces. Can people hear me? Okay.
Emily needs to reshare the slides, I think. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, great. I apologize for that. I'm not the most technologically savvy, but I really appreciate the chance to be here. And I'm going to step back and focus a bit on maternal health. So now it says I'm controlling the slides, but they're not actually moving forward. Oops. Okay, so I wanted to just provide some context and level setting for my talk about some data, some steps that I are funding for this work. Okay, so I'm coming to this work from the maternal mental health perspective, although that's obviously one component of maternal health. And I'm including here on this first slide some information from the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance, and I provide but just to provide context for everyone, 1 in 5 women will experience a maternal mental health condition defined as depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar illness, and substance use disorders during pregnancy or the year postpartum. And nearly, the vast majority of women who experience these symptoms do not get treatment. There are a variety of risk factors, which I've listed here. There are likely many more, including prior history of mental illness, lack of social support from partner, prior traumatic birth or trauma during their lives, and then experiencing having a baby in the neonatal intensive care unit. My research team actually led the work that is quoted in the bottom corner, that the cost of not treating maternal mental health conditions in the United States is estimated to be over $14 billion a year. So this is a real, societal burden of not addressing these conditions. And the vast majority, well, no, not the vast majority, but a large component, the largest component of those costs are productivity loss. So this isn't just including healthcare costs. And suicide and overdose are leading causes of death in the first year postpartum, and these are preventable deaths. So, and racial disparities and systemic racism clearly exacerbate all of these issues. I've listed a couple of reasons why here, but there are likely many more, including issues such as lack of proximity to services, lack of insurance coverage, stigma associated with mental health and how different communities feel about accessing mental health services. Certainly there's maybe a level of mistrust around treatment, whether that's therapy or medication. And then I'm going to talk about this more later in the talk about maternal mortality, but we know the alarming statistic that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. So here on this slide, I've listed what's called the Black maternal health Omnibus Act of 2020, which is actually a combination of 9 different bills in the House and Senate. And we could spend much more time than unfortunately we have here today to dive into these bills and the different concepts that they aim to address. But they cover a wide range of issues, from, investing in social determinants of health, funding community-based organizations, dealing with issues specific to women, veterans, in VA maternity care, which is another area I work in. Growing the workforce, that's a huge issue when there are, nobody in the entire Upper Peninsula in Michigan that's able to provide a treatment for perinatal behavioral health issues. And actually, providers here at Michigan provide telehealth services to them because of that issue. There's a lot of issues around making sure we have the right data. We need more investment in actual treatment, making sure incarcerated women get access to treatment, using appropriate digital technology, and then experimenting with payment models. So there's a lot of room to focus on this area. And whether this bill passes is still in question, or the set of bills rather. Here I wanted to highlight another separate bill that is specifically focused on extending postpartum coverage under Medicaid. Currently, the United States, typically for people who become eligible for Medicaid due to pregnancy, only have 60 days postpartum, which is really a very short time if you think about it. And many of the downstream sequelae of maternal morbidity may happen up to a year postpartum. So it's important to make sure that people have access to care. And so a number of states, including Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer specifically has called out this issue, are interested in trying to address this issue. And right now, you can do it through a Medicaid waiver, but this bill would make it possible at the federal level and much easier. So, there seems to be some interest in this topic, but that is also yet to be seen. I list here a couple other policy goals, not specific laws, but things to just keep in mind. We just heard a presentation about female workforce conditions and issues. And I think, paid maternity leave, we're the only industrialized country that does not have it. And, many of us here, have experienced dealing with that, and and elsewhere, it's a really important issue. With the incoming administration, this may be less of a concern, but there still always seems to be some concern about how what will happen to the Affordable Care Act, which includes the Medicaid expansion population, as well as mental health and reproductive and substance use treatment under the essential benefits. And so I think, it's important to make sure that we shore up support for that. Michigan actually recently has allowed Medicaid to bill for collaborative care, which is really important because the care spans multiple different provider types. This can include pediatricians, where mothers may get screened for mental health conditions or substance use conditions during a well child visit, yet pediatricians are not going to be the ones actually treating the mother. There's obstetrics, there's mental health, there's family medicine. So just, trying to ensure collaboration between providers provides better care. There's also issues around systematic screening and follow-up. It's not just enough to find out that someone has a condition, that we actually need to make sure they get treatment and check regularly. Someone may be feeling okay during their first trimester and then not by their third trimester, and yet often people are screened at best once during pregnancy or postpartum. An issue I'm particularly interested in is the fact that when we talk about maternal mortality, which is a slightly different issue than maternal mental health, but the CDC statistics that you hear exclude suicide, overdose, accidents, and homicide. So when you hear things like 700 women die per year in childbirth in related period, that ignores all of these other causes. And so it's a substantial underestimate, and I think a really important oversight. So I wanted to take some time here to talk about some of the studies that my research team and I are doing, and I have many of them listed in some of the papers I'll show later. But I have a parent R1 grant that I got, and then two related supplements that are focusing all using private health insurance data. We hope to get Medicaid data downstream to look at the impact of federal behavioral health policy changes. So that would be mental health parity or the Affordable Care Act on both clinical and economic outcomes for privately insured women. And so the studies have longer names, but basically the MAPLE study is focusing on perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. The BIRCH study includes both women and infants, focusing on the use of substance use disorder and specifically opioid use disorder. And the POPLAR study focuses on severe maternal morbidity and mortality. And so all these cases, we're trying to see how federal laws affect women in these circumstances. And I'm happy to talk more about those later. So I wanted to share some data now. This is the first study that we published recently last month from the MAPLE study, which is the parent study, where we were looking, this one does not actually account for any policies yet, but we were just looking at fairly descriptive trends in suicidality during pregnancy and postpartum. And what you can see in this figure is that both self-harm and suicidal ideation increased between 2006 and 2017. And then not shown in the figure, but shown on the right side in our data, Black childbearing individuals experienced the largest increase in perinatal suicidality of any racial group, which I mentioned in part talking about this issue related to disparities and trying to address this issue. Here's some new data, and this is really preliminary, so please don't cite it. I have shared it with our state partners. I have a different project that is looking at gaps between what diagnosed mental health conditions and then self-reported symptoms, because we know that not everybody who experiences symptoms might actually get a diagnosis from their provider that would show up in insurance claims, which are what we're usually using for this kind of study. And what we're showing here using data linked to the pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system is that there are large gaps in what we see if we look at data where women have self-reported on their symptoms of depression or anxiety during pregnancy or postpartum. So if you see in the second set of dots from the right, you see fairly high levels of diagnosed depression and anxiety among white women, and then somewhat higher self-reported symptoms. But in all the other race and ethnicity categories, there is a much larger gap between what we see from diagnoses and what women are reporting they experienced. And so those large gaps are another area I think that reflects a way that we need to address potential systemic racism in identifying need. So here's one last study that our team worked on. This is actually from the national inpatient sample. So this is specifically just during delivery hospitalization. It's not during pregnancy or postpartum. And this is showing differences in severe maternal morbidity with blood transfusion and without among the different race and ethnicity groups. And you can see here, especially from the left-hand panel, that non-Hispanic, Black, and American Indian or Alaska Native have, relatively higher rates of severe maternal morbidity in the United States. Now I seem, frozen. So I did want to talk about just, especially as the last speaker, of thinking ahead and how policy may evolve. Obviously, we're in a time of change. Some things that we know are changing and others we're not entirely sure yet how they will change. So obviously with the new administration coming up, there may be different approaches, although just last week, actually, both the Surgeon General and the Department of Health and Human Services released reports including calls to action on maternal mortality, although there was limited focus on maternal mental health. What happens with the Senate obviously may influence quite a bit for any of the policies that we're talking about at the federal level here today. Other speakers have mentioned this issue of, how does COVID-19 affect things? And I think certainly it can affect access to care, exacerbate gaps in care. The preliminary data that I have seen for how COVID has affected this population is that, depression and anxiety has clearly increased for delivering women and postpartum, and we'll continue to monitor that. But obviously it may be a challenging time to be having a baby, if you have to go to the hospital by yourself, wearing a mask, all sorts of things. I think there is support and bipartisan support for continuing Medicaid coverage for up to 1 year postpartum, and that may even pass before the end of the year from what I have heard, but we don't know. I guess we will see what happens. And I think, there's also more shine a spotlight on these issues, as is evidenced by this panel today and elsewhere. There's a number of really great advocacy organizations that I'm going to list here soon. And, so we'll see where we are at moving forward. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And, I know my team is trying to do their part in providing information and then getting it in the hands of policymakers who can potentially enact change. I was excited to see earlier this year that Gretchen Whitmer in her State of the State address included the data that my team had compiled on the cost of untreated perinatal mood anxiety disorders. But so here, in case people are interested, I refer you to, again, this group, the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance. They have some great information. I didn't point directly to Congress, but if you can Google these things, or you can look on individual representatives' websites. But if people are interested in more information about the Momnibus Act that I mentioned earlier and the various component bills, or the Helping Moms Act, and then again, this was Gretchen Whitmer's work. And then here we have some references from my research team that I showed in the figures. I just wanted to be sure that you saw them. I refer you to Emily Eckert. She publishes quite a lot specifically on this Medicaid coverage. And then Allison Stubbe is, if that's how you say her name, she's an obstetrician in Chapel Hill, and she likens the issue to, she talks about mothers being the wrapper and babies being the candy. And once the baby is delivered, and she's out of the wrapper gets tossed away. And I think it's important to remember what happens to women, that we're not just vehicles to deliver children, but actually have healthcare needs and rights and other issues going forward, including, in their parenting roles. So here again, some other organizations I refer you to if you're interested generally in maternal mental health, that are trying to continue to, focus on policy related work. And I will stop here, and I think it'll give us a chance for discussion. But I think, I liked this quote that I came across in an article a number of years ago about, we talk about the importance of mental health, and I think it's particularly important in the perinatal period. So here's my contact information, and I have some information on my website. And I thank you for the opportunity to present here. So I think we're now going to pivot to our larger group discussion and go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Zivin, and thank you to all of our presenters today. I think that was a lot of just fantastic information to take in as an advocate myself, just kind of wanting to dig in further and think about how we can use this information to make our cases for change at the state and federal level. This is a time where we'd like to invite you all to ask questions of our speakers today. So you can use the chat box to enter your questions there, and we'll get to them as they come through. But while you're putting in your questions, I thought maybe we'd start us off with a question about, from your perspective, our speakers today, how do you collaborate and partner with policymakers and advocates to ensure that your research and information is used to advance change on behalf of kids and families? And I know a couple of you alluded to some of those things, but maybe you can share just a little bit more with our partners listening as we wait for questions to come in the chat box.
I can start with that one. I've had the opportunity to work on some state contracts and share information and do analyses for them directly. I've also had the opportunity to present at professional conferences our findings. And so, and I've even had people then approach me to speak to some of the organizations that I listed, where I got to hear, other individuals from all sorts of different backgrounds. And so it's been really interesting to be able to have that opportunity to share some research, but also really learn from a variety of different stakeholders and community partners. And I think, and in terms of what we could advise to other people, especially if we're thinking about different interest groups and topic areas, I think they welcome information from us. Obviously it helps if we can frame it in usable ways. So, a one pager with some graphics may be better than a really dense, the minutia of your regression analysis. Not that they don't want to know numbers, but, in thinking about, it's like we're helping them for their own causes. So especially sometimes if you're not even really having an ask as much as you're saying, hey, I'd like to share this information with you that came out, you might be able to use this. I think they welcome that.
I can speak to that as well. So the way that we conduct our research is in this engaged or participatory manner, and I think it's really critical to think about trying to do research in that way, particularly when you're working with populations that are marginalized or more vulnerable. But I think in general, it's probably a good way to do research, epidemiologic research. And when we started this, and I spoke a little bit about that in my slides, but when we started this project, that pre-study period was so critical, because that was when we were attending the interagency migrant council meetings. We were listening to, those organizations and agencies that are directly working with the population and have been for years and years and are the experts, and we were listening and trying to think about how is the ways that we could work with them to develop this research program. And so I think that is a kind of how we started our relationships with our partners. And then as they've been part of the whole process. So for example, our partners would have meetings where we do data analysis meetings. So they attended those with us. We would look at transcripts and look for themes. And a lot of the analysis that I presented was with the feedback and the participation of our partners and our advocacy groups. And it helps because they have knowledge and expertise that often, maybe we don't see something and they see something different. And so that was really important. But I will say finally, just the one thing that it's been a little challenging that we have to always keep a balance of is our partners are advocates, and they're there really pushing for policy change. And what they wanted us to kind of be is the independent researchers that are getting the data, right? So that can be more powerful. And so it's this real balance of we wanted to acknowledge them and write things together, and they said, well, maybe for this let's do something a little different, because it has more impact that way. So that's how we've been working with our partners, and they were critical, for example, in helping us develop those policy recommendations regarding COVID, the COVID pandemic and the farm workers. And then they've included us in a lot of the efforts regarding the governor's executive orders and issues with that. So
just want to give an opportunity to Dr. Duke and Dr. Gardner-Neblett if you all wanted to weigh in on this question.
Well, at the education level, a challenge, which I think is probably also true for those of you in other disciplines, is that there are so many different systems and so many different organizations that touch the systems. So I've worked with the National Governors Association, the National Association of State Boards of Education, the Education Commission of the States, the Council of Chief State School Officers, on and on and on. And those are national entities. And as you know, for the most part, education is not a nationally administered endeavor in the US. It's very, very state and even local specific. So then you have your state organizations, you've got your unions, you've got intermediate or regional education associations, advocacy groups, policy groups. So it's, a lot of it is kind of finding the right entry point for the right sets of policies. So if we're talking about something like school funding equity, for example, that's really a state issue. So that's something we have to, tackle with state legislature and with the executive branch. Whereas there are some aspects of early childhood access where we can really get work done at the federal level. So part of it is kind of finding what's the right entry point to influence what piece of the work.
Had trouble unmuting myself. So I will just chime in. I'm new to Michigan, so I'm still exploring making connections here, but I'm coming from North Carolina, and for me, it was an issue of personal connections. So building relationships with people over time, and that's what I'm to build those relationships and be that person that people look to and invite to be on these workforces or these task forces to contribute the research expertise.
Great, thank you. So we do have a question in the chat box. What, if any, evaluation has there been to assess the quality and skills around providing culturally responsive health and other care support, healthcare providers, etc., for women that increases their capacity to achieve optimum health behaviors like breastfeeding?
I'm going to just can folks hear me?
I'm not sure if someone else was trying to answer it. I know a number of the people here, their work focuses on child-oriented activities. I admit I have not followed that particular topic as well. I do think there are some national efforts to support mothers generally that probably do involve some health behaviors. But I think that that is a really good question. And I'm wondering if people, not just the panelists, but at one point I saw Maria Music was on the line, or Sheila Marcus, or Kate Bullard. Some other people may be familiar with this issue. If they want to chime in, or we can come back to it. But I think it's an important question.
There are some new policies in the state of Michigan that do require some form of implicit bias training for people, healthcare providers who provide maternity care. Though a systematic way of sort of ensuring that after going through those base levels of training that people respond well to that. So I think assessing how people provide care and looking into the bias that care providers have and inequity that results in is definitely an area that's in need of some work and support.
I do know that for those of us who are working in large collaborative care programs at the state level and the national level, there's a lot of attention being paid now to beginning to address implicit bias and systemic. And so many of the educational programs that we are doing now, both at the state and the federal levels, are beginning to look at that and just simply beginning to collect data on, for instance, the race of the provider, the race of the participant or the patient or client, and beginning to think about, is it possible that race may have played a role in this particular consultation today? Because it's not something that I think we've done particularly well so far. So even to the point, so for instance, in our pediatric program, if you look at just consultations from Wayne County, though Wayne County is a predominantly Black county, most of our consultations come from providers about Caucasian children, which is why. So that in and of itself is curious. So I think it's something we need to do some work on.
I'd also like to add, it's a little bit away from what I was speaking on, but I also, like Nicole, I'm new. I just joined last year. So in my previous institution at the University of New Mexico, I was part of the Health Sciences Center there. And really a lot of the discussion around this issue of implicit bias with healthcare providers really kind of led to a lot of deep discussions about the fact that the student bodies in the different health professions are not diverse enough. And there are not enough people graduating from the various health professions that look like the populations they may be serving in different parts of the country. And so if you don't have that kind of diversity in the students that are training and then graduating, of course, doing implicit bias training and all of that is important with healthcare professionals, but I think it starts further back with the education piece.
And Dr. Handel, I think that's a great segue into one of the questions that is in the chat box specifically for Dr. Gardner-Neblett and Dr. Duke. What, if any, effort has there been made to increase the numbers of teachers who are people of color as another mechanism for mirrors as well as windows?
It's a great question. We have essentially the same problem that Dr. Handel just outlined, which is that our teaching force in the US does not look like the children in the US, and the statistics are very poor. And then in contrast, there's research to suggest that if a child of color has even one teacher over the course of their school career, I can't remember the exact statistics, I think it's from kindergarten to 8th grade, if an African-American child, for example, has one teacher who shares their same racial background, that child is more likely to graduate. And I can't remember all the statistics, maybe you remember, Nicole, but it's just, it's pretty compelling, the research to suggest that, the race and the racial match or mismatch between teacher and student does matter. So there are a variety of efforts that have been in place to try to increase the proportion of teachers of color, especially Black teachers. And they've gotten a real infusion of attention, I'm glad to say, in about the last 6 months. So I'm trying to even enter college so that they're interested, you're building a pipeline essentially from high school on for educators. So I had the privilege this summer of working with and the summer before for a while, working with the Center for Black Educator Development. And one of the ways the Center for Black Educator Development does their work, this is under the leadership of Sharif El-Mekki in Philadelphia, is that they run a summer program that's for children, but it's staffed by college and high school students. So the college and high school students are really able to see firsthand, they're able to work with children it's all for children of color, predominantly African-American children, able to firsthand, experience the rewarding aspects of teaching very early, and hopefully that will shape then their career trajectory. So that's one of the efforts I know of that so far looks really promising. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Just to echo what you've said in terms of it being so important, and the example you gave, it's about planting seeds so that Black students from early on see this as a possibility. And if they've not had positive experiences in school from their own teachers, it's going to be less likely that they have even thought about it. And I will say, Dr. Duke doesn't realize how influential she is. She came and gave a lecture to my class a few weeks ago, and a student told me yesterday that because of that, she wants to be a teacher now. So planting these seeds is so important to just even give students the possibility that this is something they could go into.
This has been a really great just panel and discussion, and unfortunately we are getting close to an end here our time together. Just want to again thank our fantastic speakers today for everything that you imparted on us and giving us so much to think about and look forward to as we continue to advocate to improve things for all kids and families here in our state. So appreciate that all of you so much in the work that you're doing, and appreciate all of our partners, our participants today for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Miller and Dr. Rosenblum for some closing remarks.
Sure, I can go. And I was just putting a comment in the chat as well, reflecting on how, COVID and the current pandemic might, inequitably about teachers and other people we've discussed today. But I think, of course, that's going to be important to track and figure out. Thank you all so much for presenting all this great work from all these different perspectives. I was so struck by both just the specifics of talking about policies at different levels, and what you said, Nell, was about the finding the right entry point for which policy. And I think that's so hard sometimes for academics, certainly to wrap their heads around, but so critically important. And so I think a talk like this, I had a lot of great ideas. I wrote all over pages, and I felt like we really got a sense of going from this sort of research to policy implications that were specific and that were also really informed by, knowing your populations and what they're facing. So I thought that was a really, really important sort of thread throughout the talks. And I think also the other thing that struck me that I think about a lot, but it was just so great to be bathed in these talks, was just the interconnectedness of greater social context. And I like work as a structural determinant of health, and thinking about maternal as these big policies, seep in and impact individual lives and individual women. And person. So I think that even within our own fields where we deeply care and appreciate that the way that social ecological model shapes everything, sometimes it's good to just have the reminder of hearing talks from everybody. So hopefully that's something that this translational network, that's sort of our goal. And so I was also thrilled to see all the participants coming in from lots of different schools and units and places. And it's really exciting to have heard all these talks today. So thank you. I can turn it over to Kate.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to echo the enthusiasm for these incredible presentations that I really actually felt on the edge of my seat the whole time, which doesn't always happen. I will be honest, it just really was exciting to hear what you had to share with us today. I feel very inspired. I know that we will take this forward. We'll work with the panelists to think about how to summarize and to make sure that others have access to information that was shared today. So this isn't the end of the train. This is a beginning sort of step. We hope to take this forward. I could draw out so many points from every talk, but I think one thing I was just thinking about for myself was I really appreciated the order that things were shared, the sort of ground setting that you provided us with, Alicia, from the sort of the data from the state. But then I was also thinking, Dr. Nebla Gardner, that you really gave us, I thought, an incredible framework for all of these presentations. Actually, I kept thinking about this. Not just the curb cut, because I love that, but I was thinking about, as you were sort of focusing on literacy, you sort of laid out the problems with the way we frame the questions, and the way that takes us away from really thinking about how achieving racial justice is a mandate. It is critical for us to think about equity, but also to really be careful about how we frame the question and instead to really think about, how this is being framed, to, really set high expectations. That's what we want to do for everyone, to really attend to all of the systemic racism, historical legacies, the impact present. And I thought that cut across every single presentation in these really amazing ways. And then to really think about how when we attend to the experiences of Black and Brown children, we're not only doing the thing that is absolutely right, but we're really thinking about how to, elevate what we are doing for children and families nationally, in really important ways. So I just am super grateful for that framework and for all that you've shared and for the time and attention of those who have attended. And for those who are part of our translational network, fantastic. If there are some of you who aren't part of our network, I hope you'll reach out to us and join. And thank you so much for your time and for just this really rich, wonderful discussion. So, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.